37mm automatic gun, M4, is the largest of our aircraft weapons. Efficient care of this formidable weapon requires knowledge of its mechanism and skill and dexterity in the various operations of disassembly and assembly. As with all our weapons, only a few simple tools are needed in stripping and assembling the 37mm gun. A barrel bushing wrench, a strap pipe wrench, and a piston rod nut wrench are supplied with the gun. The only other tools needed for disassembly are a small screwdriver, a crescent wrench, and a pair of pliers. Long-nosed pliers are handy, but not necessary. Although the 37mm gun looks like a complicated weapon, it is not. It is as easy to strip and assemble as any of our other weapons. To remove the tube or barrel, the lock frame is pulled to the rear until it is engaged and held there. This is extremely important because when the lock frame is forward, the extractor is in a recess in the end of the tube. If the tube is turned, the extractor will be twisted and ruined. Therefore, the lock frame must be to the rear. The tube bushing is then unscrewed with the tube bushing wrench. It is unscrewed only until the threads are disengaged, and it is left on the tube to act as a support as the tube itself is unscrewed. The pipe wrench is placed around the tube at any convenient place and the tube lock depressor pushed to the rear as far as it will go in order to unlock the tube. This schematic cutaway shows the principle of the tube lock. The tube, which has a right-hand thread, is unscrewed and removed from the trunnion block. The shoulder at the rear of the tube will carry the bushing forward with it. The tube bushing is split and has notches to allow for the insertion of a screwdriver to assist in separating the two halves. To replace the tube, the procedure is reversed, except that it is not necessary to push on the tube lock depressor, since the lock will engage in the barrel automatically. Be sure the lock frame is held to the rear. It is good practice to screw the tube into the gun by hand until it stops. Then back off a half turn, and with a quick snap of the wrists, turn it into position. The bushing is now tightened. Always check to be sure the tube actually is locked in position. Visual inspection will show readily whether the lock is fully engaged in the slot in the tube. To remove the breech block, it is necessary to retract the lock frame until it is held to the rear. The breech block stop is pushed in and the breech block pulled downward and taken out. The cover then is removed. Releasing the carrier catch will allow the lock frame to go forward. The driving springs then are released by pulling out slightly on the flat leaf spring at the side of the hook and rotating it out of the way. The hook then can be released readily. The back plate is removed by releasing the latch and forcing the plate downward. The lock frame can now be taken out at the rear. The lock frame should be grasped in one hand and the operating lever in the other. And after removal from the body, the operating lever should be eased forward. This is important, as the operating lever is easily tripped forward and can cause injury. Before stripping the lock frame, be sure to release the sear in order to relieve the compression of the hammer spring. A screwdriver is inserted in the head of the operating lever spring, and the head pushed forward and turned slightly to the left to release it. The head is removed. Then the follower and the operating lever spring. To remove the operating lever, the cotter pin is withdrawn. Then the operating lever pin is taken out. And the operating lever set aside. The cotter pin is removed from the sear pin, the sear is depressed, and the pin removed. The sear and the sear spring then are taken out. The cotter pin is removed from the hammer pin. With the finger held over the end of the hammer spring guide to keep it and the spring from flying out, the hammer pin is pulled out. The guide and spring then are taken out. The cotter pin is removed from the cocking lever pin, and when the pin is removed, the cocking lever will drop out. The hammer will now slide out easily at the rear. The extractor and its heavy spring are not removed except for replacement. The lock frame is reassembled in reverse order. The hammer slides in easily. The cocking lever must be inserted with the arc pointing toward the front of the lock frame. Think of this lever as being a hammer, which its shape resembles, and imagine you are driving a nail. The lever can be inserted the wrong way, but if you think of it as a hammer, you will do it the right way. The pin is inserted to hold the cocking lever. Always use a new cotter pin and be sure it is properly spread. The hammer spring and hammer spring guide are inserted at the rear. While the spring is held compressed, the pin is placed in position. A new cotter pin replaces the old one. The sear spring and sear are placed in position and held compressed while the pin is inserted. A cotter pin then is placed through the sear pin. The operating lever is placed in position and held there by its pin. A new cotter pin is placed and spread. The operating lever spring with its head and follower is inserted. Care is taken that the strut is properly seated in the follower. After assembly, the lock frame should be tested. Before replacing the lock frame, the breech block is pushed upward into position. The operating handle of the lock frame must be held to the rear in order that the studs will engage in the cam grooves properly. The carrier catch also must be released before the lock frame can be pushed all the way forward. The driving springs, then, are hooked onto the lock frame. The back plate is replaced. With the cover removed, the feed crank is lifted out. The swivel connector is removed. The feed lever pin lock, the feed lever pin, and the feed lever are taken out. The feed slide lever pin and the feed slide lever are removed. The feed slide bridge pin lock is taken out by lifting up on the leaf spring, turning it out of its recess and lifting it out. The feed slide bridge is removed by pushing it slightly toward the left side of the gun and lifting it out. The feed slide is removed by releasing the belt holding pawl and pulling the slides out. The carrier pin is removed by loosening the screw and turning the leaf spring out of its seat. Then the pin is taken out. The carrier with the carrier dog can now be lifted out. The carrier catch is removed by pressing in on the spring plunger with a screwdriver. Care must be taken that the plunger and spring do not fly out. The plunger and spring are removed. The belt holding pawls need not be removed if they are kept properly lubricated. The feed box components are reassembled in reverse order. First, the carrier catch plunger and spring and the carrier catch. In replacing the carrier, be sure the dog is under the stop. Then the following are replaced in order: the carrier pin, the feed slide, the feed slide bridge, the feed slide bridge pin lock, the feed slide lever, the feed slide lever pin, the feed lever, the feed lever pin, the feed lever pin lock, the swivel connector, and finally, the crank. In practice, it will be found slower and more difficult than this to line up the swivel and replace the crank. The assembly then is tested. To remove the tube extension, the driving springs are released and taken out. The tube, the lock frame, the carrier, and feed lever already must have been taken out. The breech block stop is depressed and held in that position by inserting a screwdriver under the head of the bolt at the rear. The piston rod nut pin is removed with the special wrench. The tube extension now can be taken out at the rear. The pin is removed from the trigger trip and the trigger trip taken out. The trigger lever pin and trigger lever are removed. The trigger lever plunger and spring are lifted out. The tube extension is reassembled in reverse order. We begin with the trigger lever spring and plunger. Next comes the trigger lever, the trigger lever pin, the trigger trip, the trigger trip pin, the piston rod nut, and finally, the driving spring rods. The accuracy life of this cannon is largely dependent upon the kind of care and attention given it. The bore and chamber are cleaned thoroughly with a solution of 1/2 pound of soda ash in a gallon of water, then wiped completely dry and oiled with a light coat of lubricating oil. The gun must be cleaned and oiled daily and after firing. The latest issue of lubricating oil should be used when preparing to fire, but it has no preservative qualities whatever, and sperm oil must be used to prevent rust if the gun is not to be fired. The moving parts should all be oiled lightly with a brush. If cloth or waste is used, lint may be left in the gun. The moving parts should be oiled as they are maneuvered, in order to ensure proper distribution of the oil to all moving surfaces. It is very important that the recuperator cylinder be completely filled with oil in order to take up the shock of the recoil. The gun is elevated about 5 degrees from the horizontal and the filling plug removed. The oil is poured slowly into the cylinder until it is visible in the bottom of the filling hole. Then the outside walls of the cylinder are slapped with the hands to force the escape of any air trapped in the cylinder. This jarring of the cylinder and the filling are continued alternately until the oil remains stationary at the bottom of the hole. The filling plug then is replaced. In removing the magazine from the gun, the endless belt is taken off first. Red marks indicate the links where the belt is connected. A small connecting pin is unscrewed, and removed with a pair of pliers. The cover then is taken off. The lifter stud is depressed and the feeder holding pawl pushed out. The belt now can be pulled out and removed. The cotter pins and bolts are removed from the top of the magazine. The cotter pins then are taken from the magazine retaining pins. Then the pins are pulled out. The right half of the magazine is removed. The magazine latches are released, and the left half of the magazine is removed. The cover is replaced, and the job is done. To load the 30-round magazine, the plate on the lower right side is removed. The rounds are pressed into the links, and the belt moved by hand as the loading progresses. When 30 rounds have been placed in the belt, a resistance to further travel will be noticed, indicating that loading is complete. The plate then is replaced. To load the gun, the lock frame is pulled to the rear until it is engaged and held there. One pull of the loading handle releases the lock frame and throws a cartridge into the chamber, and the gun is ready for firing. This gun always must be cleaned and oiled after firing as well as every day. In order to do this efficiently, much practice in stripping and assembling is necessary. The 37mm cannon is an efficient and effective weapon and should be given the best of care.